I remember the exact moment he said it. The ballroom was glowing, cameras flashing, executives clapping as my father celebrated 40 years of success. Then he lifted his glass, smiled for the crowd, and said, "My son will carry the legacy, not my useless daughter." The laughter wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. Every eye turned to me, waiting to see if I'd break. I didn't. I smiled the way I always do when he reduces me to a footnote in his story. What no one in that room knew was that 2 weeks earlier, a quiet meeting with a lawyer had changed everything. While he was preparing his retirement speech, I was reading documents with my name printed beside a number he would never expect. And as the applause faded that night, I realized something important. He thought I had nothing. He had no idea what was already mine. 2 days after the party, I didn't send an angry text, didn't post a cryptic quote, didn't defend myself to relatives who suddenly wanted my side. I booked a meeting, not with him, with the firm that had managed my grandfather's estate for 23 years. The same firm my father trusted blindly. The same firm that had been quietly sending quarterly reports addressed to a name he never bothered to ask about, mine. When I walked into the glass conference room overlooking the city skyline, no one called me useless. They stood up. They shook my hand. They slid a leather folder across the table and said, "It activates upon his retirement." My father thought retirement meant applause and golf invitations. He didn't realize it also meant disclosure. The trust wasn't just money sitting in an account. It was structured ownership. $17 million tied to voting shares. Conditional control clauses. Protective leverage designed by a man who had built the company from nothing and knew exactly how ego could rot it from the inside. My grandfather never believed in loud lessons. He believed in timed ones. By noon, the board had been notified of the activation. By 3, my father's assistant had called me twice. By 5, his tone had shifted from confusion to irritation. "Why am I hearing about this from directors?" he demanded when I finally answered. I kept my voice even. "Because they read the paperwork." Silence. Then sharper. "You went behind my back." I almost reminded him of the stage, the microphone, the word useless, but I didn't. I didn't need to. "It was always there," I said. "You just never looked." What shook him wasn't the amount. It was the design. The trust didn't replace him. It restrained decisions that could harm the company's long-term stability. Major asset sales required my signature. Executive compensation adjustments required dual approval. Leadership appointments could be challenged with a single vote. Mine. He had spent years assuming I was ornamental, a daughter to mention politely, a liability to joke about publicly. Now every strategic move passed through someone he dismissed. The emergency board meeting that evening was tense. I attended virtually. Cameras on, shoulders back. Calm. One director cleared his throat. "We need clarity moving forward." My father tried to control the narrative. "This is procedural. She's young. She won't interfere." I let him finish. Then I spoke. "I don't plan to interfere. I plan to protect." That word landed differently. Protect from what? From impulsive expansions. From legacy-driven pride projects, from risk taken to prove relevance, the same risks my grandfather had written safeguards against, the same risks that had nearly cost the company everything once before, something only a few people in that room remembered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The numbers spoke. The clauses spoke. The structure spoke. When the meeting ended, messages flooded in. Some cautious, some suddenly respectful. Power rearranges posture. My father called again that night, but this time there was no anger, just tight control. "What do you want?" he asked. Not "who do you think you are?" Not "how dare you?" What do you want? That was the shift. I looked out at the city lights and realized something steady and unshakable. I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition of reality. I want governance. I said transparency, accountability, sustainability, corporate words, clean words, unemotional words. He exhaled slowly, as if recalculating me for the first time. The man who once laughed at my ambitions now had to negotiate with them. And the most ironic part, I hadn't built this trap. He had, by underestimating me, by assuming access meant ownership, by believing silence meant absence. The trust was never about money. It was about timing. It waited until the applause faded, until the spotlight moved, until the man who called me useless stepped down from the podium and into paperwork. He thought the night of his retirement was the end of his authority story. He had no idea it was the beginning of mine. In the end, there was no dramatic showdown, no public apology, no tearful reconciliation under chandelier lights. There was structure. There was consistency. There was quiet correction. I focused on strengthening what mattered, tightening risk management, aligning executive incentives with long-term growth, reinforcing compliance policies my grandfather once insisted on. The company began to feel less like a stage and more like an institution again. Results replaced speeches. Stability replaced ego. And slowly, something else shifted too. My father stopped speaking over me in meetings. He asked for my assessment before final votes. The first time he said, "Let's hear her perspective," the room didn't tense. It simply listened. Respect had stopped being conditional. It had become procedural. At family gatherings, he no longer introduced me as the daughter still figuring things out. He used my title correctly, without hesitation. It wasn't warmth. It was recognition. And recognition, when it comes from someone who once dismissed you, carries weight. One evening after a long strategy session, we stood alone in the boardroom. The city lights reflected against the glass walls, quiet and distant. He cleared his throat and said, "I misjudged you." No drama, no excuses, just that. I didn't say, "I know." I didn't say, "You hurt me." I simply nodded, because the correction was already visible in every policy we had implemented, every balanced quarter, every decision filtered through accountability instead of pride. I never used the trust to corner him. I used it to anchor the company. That was the difference. Power used to control creates fear. Power used to protect creates stability. The insult at his retirement party could have been the start of a war. Instead, it became the moment I stopped trying to earn validation from someone who only respected outcomes. I didn't need to humiliate him back. I needed to ensure no one could ever publicly diminish me again without facing facts. Over time, the narrative changed, not because I demanded it, but because performance rewrote it. Investors trusted us. Employees felt secure. The board operated with clarity. And my father, he learned to measure strength differently. Not by volume, not by legacy claims, but by consistency. I didn't inherit authority. I stepped into responsibility. And responsibility doesn't shout, it sustains. He didn't lose his company. He lost the assumption that I was ornamental. I didn't win a battle. I established a boundary. They didn't lose me that night in the ballroom. They lost the version of me that waited quietly